Okay, so welcome to the CWT Business YouTube channel. I wanted to start making videos on different books that I'm reading. I've made it a big goal this year to start reading more books, and I figured one way to do that is to start also giving reviews on the books that I'm reading, because then I kind of have to start reading more. And the first book that I wanted to review is The Way of the Wolf by Jordan Belfort. And the reason I picked this book is because one, it's about sales, and sales is how I've spent my career. And two, it's almost more of a controversial book just by the author itself, so I thought it would be kind of good to talk about. And then first, I want to talk about why I read the book to begin with, and that's mainly because I wanted to really hear his thoughts on sales in the first place. So that's why I originally read the book. I was working in sales and still do work in sales, and I was curious what he thought and what his methodology would be, and I thought it was pretty interesting. Now, first of all, is it actually helpful? So I've done a lot of different kind of sales in my career. I started off doing door-to-door sales, selling internet, and then I've also done enterprise software. I did different kind of like vacationing products. I've sold many different types of things, B2C and B2B. And I do think that this book, while it's really good if you're on the business to consumer side rather than the B2B side. And I'll get into why I think that, but first I want to say, a caveat on that part. I think it can be really good for the B2B side, but it would be more better on actually setting the meetings and doing the initial cold calls and stuff like that than actually carrying an 8-month long enterprise software deal in the first place. I think this book is really good when it talks about cold calling, how to overcome objections and get it back to the pitch. And once it's focused on that part and overcoming, I think it does a really good job. Now, obviously, there's some parts in the book where it's how to overcome the objection. I want to think about it. And I do think that's, at least in my experience, I think that's very helpful in a business to consumer standpoint, or even setting a meeting or something like that, on a cold call, trying to get a meeting. If they're let me think about it, you'd obviously want to overcome that. But if you're selling an 8-month long enterprise SaaS deal to a very big business, obviously when they say, let me think about it, you say, that makes sense, or they're not even the actual buyer to begin with. I don't know, it's just more complicated. But on actual selling, and then the straight line process itself, where it talks about how every sale's the same, and I do think that no matter what you're selling, it almost always comes down to introduction, establish rapport, do a good discovery, do a pitch, overcome the objections, and then close it. And when it talks about how it's all the straight line, and the customer might try to get people off or get you off the straight line and dwell down all these different paths, but you should always then take that back to the actual straight line. When they give you an objection, a lot of times the real objection is not even what they said in the first place. They might say, this sounds really great, but let me think about it. What they're actually saying is, this sounds really great, but I'm still not sure if I want to buy this right now. And then while you have to deal with the objection they just gave you, you have to then loop it back into the sale and do a much better pitch, go back to that part and try to basically figure out what the actual objection really is. And I don't know, I think it's a good way to kind of, especially when you're starting off, to kind of think about sales and think about what to do when that stuff comes, and just remember, okay, no matter what they're saying, what I really need to do is get them back on the straight line to begin with. And I think the book does a really good job of that. I think it's really interesting to learn about the straight line process itself, and how he would handle certain objections. I think it's a very good book to check out if you're in sales, especially if you're in business to consumer sales and you're trying to find better ways to cold call, or you're nervous making cold calls because you don't really know what to do. It kind of gives you a good framework to work off of, I think. But again, with the one caveat that if you're selling B2B, or especially enterprise B2B, sometimes the sale is just more complicated itself. But this is really good book on learning how to cold call, what to say on a cold call, how to overcome the objections on a cold call, and the initial conversations you're having with people. I think it does a really good job. I also think the book itself is just interesting. He talks about different stories in his past, which I think is interesting. I think it's written really well, where like, at least in my experience, now this is strictly just talking about me, sometimes on like books like this, you always want to put it down after a little bit because you're like, okay, that was a lot on my brain. This is not one of those books. It's really easy to read, it's fun to read, you get to like, while there's a lot of learning in it, there's also a lot of stories, so it keeps you engaged in it. I think it's a very well written book. I think it's a very interesting book, and I think if you're into B2C sales and are curious about it, I think it'd be a good one to check out. And if you do want to buy it, I did put it in my bookstore link in bio on my Amazon page, so you can get it there and join my newsletter. But yeah, that's really my thoughts on the actual book itself. I recommend it. I think it's pretty interesting. So check it out if sales and is your career or just something you're interested in. I don't think you can go wrong with it. So that's my recommendation.